reviewing Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey and trying to address the criticisms and compliments coming from a lot of different directions, including disagreements among sort of fellow travelers artistically and politically. It's a lot to unpack. It really is. There are definitely legitimate criticisms of Nolan's interpretation of the original epic poem, of course. But I also think some of the criticisms of what are unquestionably disagreeable casting choices and some cringeworthy dialogue may be a bit overstated. But first, why don't we hear from Christopher Nolan in his own words about his mind's eye when it came to how he chose to interpret Homer on screen.
Can you tell me about it? I mean, and how you see it? Because it's articulated very clearly in the film.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as I was really going back to the poem and looking at, okay, what fuels all this? What's sort of there behind it? You have this concept of xenia. We don't refer to it as xenia in the film because I think that would be confusing. So we just refer to it as Zeus's law. But it's that idea that, you might look like a humble beggar, but you could be a god in disguise. And that becomes the theological underpinning for a society that saw gods everywhere. Gods walked amongst us back then in everybody's estimation. It becomes the theological underpinning of the golden rule, of the idea that, treat others as you would be treated, and that being the glue that binds society together. The more I thought about it, the more that became important to the project, because the more you realize that, back then, leaving the house for more than, a day or two, you're by definition throwing yourself at the mercy of strangers. And society can only function with respect for strangers. The more you look at it, the more we talked about it, the more we started bringing the project together, the more you realize nothing's changed. We're just as dependent on that. Nothing's changed in that regard. And so it's a point of connection with this text of 3,000 years ago that isn't just a great adventure story, but it's also a kind of ethical and moral foundation that connects us to a very different time.
And I think that explanation has been misinterpreted as sort of like a thinly veiled support for open borders or something. And that's actually not Zeus's law as it's presented. It's hospitality to the stranger that runs in both directions. So it doesn't necessarily implicate getting to call your shot when you want, for how long you want, and impose upon somebody. It is a reciprocity, the golden rule. One other aspect of this, because she has been at the center of the controversies with respect to this interpretation, as it was her interpretation of the Odyssey that allegedly Nolan informed Nolan's artistic presentation on screen. I'm talking about Emily Wilson, who's a British classicist who teaches at University of Pennsylvania, and she was asked about the Odyssey as an anti-war text.
What did you think about the film in terms of this notion of the Odyssey as an anti-war text?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought I want to, not spoil anything about the film, because I know the majority of people haven't seen the film. The film has these flashbacks to the Trojan War. I'm not sure if I see it as an entirely anti-war film, but it certainly presents us with an Odysseus who feels very bad about certain things that he's done in war and is struggling to process them in a very, I would say, very modern, psychiatrized way. And he's struggling to process them and needs drugs to do so for help with his recovery.
Right.
And he seems to feel bad about being a warrior, and we never actually get to see him doing much warrioring, which I thought in a way was a bit of a shame. I mean, we do get to see the boat, which is lovely, but I think in some ways, I was realizing, thinking about the film, there's a tolerance for ambiguity in the world of the Odyssey, which I don't think there exactly is in the world of Hollywood blockbuster action films.
Right.
And I think that's one of the big challenges for Nolan, right?
Yeah.
Is that he has to make the protagonist a likable all-American hero,
right,
which is a real challenge if you're basing this on a poem where the hero is not necessarily motivated by romantic love or being a nice suburban parent, but actually he wants glory, and he wants to get spoils from the sack of a city, which is, you'll see what Nolan does with all of that, but it's different things from what Homer does.
Right.
I kept looking in vain for a sense that this was a film about glory. I think it's a film that has some interest in shame, but I don't think it has any interest in glory.
I was going to ask you.
Well, I mean, first of all, as to Odysseus not doing too much warring, I think if you see the film, that is a questionable contention. Some of the criticisms from the right, this is a good example of something I think is way overheated. Matt Walsh over at Daily Wire. Nolan strips the gods out of the Odyssey entirely. Only goddesses show up, and then only as PTSD hallucinations. Nolan's apologists will say that he did this because he was going for a more grounded film. Oh, okay. So then why does ancient Greece have the demographic makeup of LA circa 2026? Why is there a tiny little woman running around pretending to be a dude? Why is there an Asian guy delivering the line, "We're Greeks from Ithaca"? Grounded? Really? Grounded in what? The apologists are letting Nolan have his cake and eat it too, like always. Yeah, and I think some of attitudes got poisoned by the marketing of the film by its cast, particularly Lupita Nyong'o, who plays Helen of Troy, and this was one of the controversial casting choices. But she's there, but this is not a significant role in the film in terms of screen time. But I mean, it was the things that she said in the, as I said, in the promotion of the film that I think sort of poisoned some people that would have been more open-minded to it.
I'd be like, so Homer, how do you feel about the screen time given to these women, considering how little you spent with them? Okay.
And then do you lean forward and look at him like that?
Yes.
Yeah, that was to the question. What would
Remember
you say to Homer? And she gives, the typical identitarian answer, which is just so exhausting and tiresome. All right, well, let's unpack this with a classicist, so somebody much more well-versed than myself. Spencer Klavan is associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. He's also the host of the Young Heretics podcast. Spencer, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dan, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I know, generally speaking, you liked the movie making and storytelling of Christopher Nolan, as did I. And I noticed some of the things that other people noticed, but you don't place too much weight on them. And one of the things I wanted to get to you on, because I think there's some nuance there if you actually look at the source material, is this idea that Odysseus was remorseful about the sacking of Troy, about the use of the Trojan horse as artifice. And this is hotly debated. He was in search of glory. He was never mournful or regretful of sacking Troy, or it's a whole sort of PTSD invention that pollutes the film. Those seem to be the two contentions.
That's right. It is one of the most controversial choices that Nolan made, and I do think it's a change from the poem. He makes Odysseus remorseful, as you say, about sacking Troy, especially about the famous trick of the Trojan horse, which is part of his character and his legend, that he's so wily and resourceful that he's able to come up with this ruse. And Nolan puts remorse and guilt over that at the center of his character, which I don't think it is in the poem. So that's true. That's a more modern take. Also, though, there are moments, extraordinary moments in Homer, where Odysseus expresses great sorrow over the war. I'm thinking especially of this time where he's listening to a poet sing the song of the Trojan horse. So his own exploit is being sung in a way a lot like Homer is singing it. And Odysseus breaks down in tears. He weeps. And he's compared in his weeping to a woman who her husband has been killed in war. So there's very strong suggestion that he's identifying here with the victims of his own war. There are also moments that Nolan cut out. I'm thinking especially of Achilles in the underworld, the great hero of the Iliad, shows up as a ghost in the underworld in the Odyssey, and he says, I made the wrong choice by going to war. I should have just lived out a peaceful life far away and never gone to battle for glory. So it is true that Odysseus is a soldier. He doesn't regret the war in Homer the way he does in Nolan's version. But Homer is full of understanding and pathos for the suffering and the sorrow of both waging war and also being a victim of war. So that part is not totally out of the realm of interpretation. I do think, though, that Nolan is probably more of a modern, even maybe influenced to some extent by Christian sensibilities when he has this sense of kind of sin and guilt over what Odysseus has done.
Well, not to mention the golden rule, characterizing Zeus's law as the golden rule. I mean, right? The casting, because that's obviously another point of contention. I mean, Anne Hathaway is very tough for me. As much as people are talking about
people don't like her. I don't know. There's something about her that just gets on people.
Yeah, well, she's a bad actress. That's what gets on me. But I mean, the casting choices. Obviously the. Part of it, and it's not that he does a nice job, I think, John Leguizamo, but he's another guy that was out there playing identitarian politics, talking about Latinos in Hollywood, and just give me a break. And same thing with the Helen of Troy actress. I think it somewhat polluted it, but by the same token, people need to remember Christopher Nolan is playing for an Academy Award here, and you have to essentially clear a quota in terms of the identitarian composition of your cast in order to qualify for Oscars, and that had to be part of what influenced. I mean, whether good or bad, that had to be part of what influenced his choices.
Yeah, I wish that wasn't true. I really hate these quotas, and I think the whole attitude that's inspired them is wrong-headed and anti-American. I think it's much closer to true American sensibility to be just colorblind rather than obsessing over these identitarian categories and all of that. So it is something that, Nolan got in his own way. The actors got in their own way. That clip you played from Lupita was just fabulously silly.
Yeah.
Homer is actually filled with fascinating female characters. If anything, Lupita's beef is with Nolan, who's cut out a lot of the most impressive and interesting female characters in the poem. But
you had to make more screen time for Charlize Theron as Calypso.
No,
obviously.
Exactly. He's so obsessed with Charlize, he can't get the camera off her. But so the thing about this, though, for me is it became so central to people's idea about the movie, the conversation about the movie, before anybody had even seen it, that it just mounted to the point of an obsession when, as you say, these are very small moments in the movie. They take up, 5-10 minutes of screen time, most of them. And one thing that did, funnily enough, is it actually made it harder for people with legitimate criticisms of the movie to be taken seriously, because the pre-lash was so over the top and so focused on the wrong things that it meant, people got dismissed as cranks, so they seemed to be going into the movie determined to hate it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that was a real just tactical error. Never mind whether, I understand if the casting bothers you, but I don't think that people kept their heads about it in a way that was particularly helpful, and it made the conversation very, very strange around this movie.
Which is not to say there were not cringeworthy episodes of dialogue, like, for example, Penelope, the Anne Hathaway, Athena. Penelope, the Anne Hathaway character, talking to Telemachus, and the throne has been absent for 20 years, and she basically says, "What about my years of experience?" Like she's auditioning, or like she's doing a job interview for. I mean, it's just sort of like that. Just was one of those like, oh come on, that there was no sensibility to that. That is so forced. So there are a few examples of that kind of thing.
Well, Christopher Nolan's not a very good writer. I mean, this is something like he's such an impressive visual storyteller, and he's made some movies that I have really loved, and I really enjoyed this one too. But Interstellar, the Dark Knight trilogy, Memento, some of these are classics. But he is where he's a real visionary is in these set pieces that he puts together. And my favorite parts of this movie, are the Circe scene, the big mythological adventure stories in the middle are really beautifully done.
Right.
But he has a problem with Homer's language, and he doesn't really get it across, I agree, in a particularly persuasive way. So, that different people will be more and less bothered by it. I kind of figured going in that this is a blockbuster, and Nolan's not the world's greatest writer, but that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Like the movie making and the storytelling, even with some of the parts that were cut out, but it does present as relatively seamless, and it is grand. And to see it in a theater, I think is a much better experience than waiting for it to come, on the streaming services. It's really something. I mean, you mentioned a couple of them. The Scylla and Charybdis episode too. I mean, all of the interactions or adventures with the supernatural forces or the monsters are pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think he deserves real praise for that, especially because a lot of modern interpretations are afraid to put that stuff on screen. There was a movie that I really disliked a couple years ago called The Return, which is Umberto Pasolini, an Italian director, I believe. The Matt Walsh criticism you read was really true of that movie, of The Return. You want to see a movie that strips all of the supernatural out and makes it all about this drab, glum, modern world. It's The Return. This movie is actually pretty impressive in the way that it just goes for some of these stories. And I loved that. I love that about Homer. The stuff we remember from this poem is all fantastical, mythological stuff. The Cyclops, Circe, Scylla and Charybdis you mentioned. We get these monsters and these supernatural transformations and these kind of mythological encounters, which is something that I think Nolan has been really good about throughout his career. He doesn't shy away from epic and adventure. And that is a core part of this story. So I was really glad to see him just do that kind of in full. And I think his treatment of the gods was also pretty impressive, actually. Although, he doesn't go as full bore with the gods, it's true, but he does give us an impression that these people are moving through a world that is haunted by spirits, haunted by powers beyond their control, powers that are challenging them to confront their own accountability or even maybe, their powerlessness in the face of these grand forces and their destiny. So all of that I thought was just fantastic.
I've read some critiques too of Matt Damon, that the choice of Matt Damon for Odysseus, that it should have been somebody more formidable. It should have been something like Agamemnon rather than Matt Damon, a more like dark, foreboding, formidable figure. I actually thought Damon was pretty good. What was your take?
Yeah, Odysseus, again, the whole poem is kind of about who is this guy? The narrator opens with the announcement, "O Muse, sing to me of a man," right? And he is a twisty, turny, polytropos is the Greek word, kind of many-layered or many-wayed man. And then he's not there in the poem for like the first 4 out of 24 books. He's kind of an absence. Telemachus, his son, is looking for him. He shows up on Calypso's island and he's longing for home, but he's also, going on all these adventures. He's disguising himself. He has to pretend to be somebody else all the time. And so there's really a sense that, this is a hero in war. He's also a father. He's also a husband. He's also a king. How can he be all those things at once, right? How can he be so strong in battle, but also sensitive and tender when he hears poetry, and so clever and slippery when he's devising tricks? So you actually do need a really good actor to play this role, and you need a real sense of the complexity in who this guy is. I thought that both Nolan and Damon get like a B+ from me on this. It's impossible to get the fullness of this guy on screen, I think, out of the poem. That's why the poem is a work of genius, and we should all go back and read it again as many times as we can, because it's so rich. But we do get at moments from Matt Damon. I think he's been overly criticized for being too much of a shrinking, guilt-laden coward, or he's too kind of weighed down by his guilt. We do get, he shoots the Cyclops in the eye with an arrow for no other reason than that he's just, ticked off about the killing of his men. We get the moment where he ties himself to the mast and listens to the siren song while all his men are, just so that he can hear it. And so I think there is a sense of adventure in this guy. There's a sense of kind of daring do. There's less of a sense of humor than there is in the poem. There are fewer jokes, fewer kind of escapades and capers, maybe less fun. And I think that's true just in general with Nolan. He tends to be a little bit, epic and heavy-handed and sometimes maybe even grim. But so, yeah, I thought, pretty good, not the best ever, and a good reason to go back and read the poem.
Last point, too, just in terms of the critiques out there. The idea, sure, of course, there's going to be artistic license taken. There will be competing interpretations of this in modern context, and some people want to stay truer to the text, and others will be more liberal about that. But one of the arguments is, it's all fine, that's all well and good, but when do we ever get anything that is actually true to the text when we're talking about a Western canon, such that it is handed down in a accurate form, if you will, to succeeding generations? And the argument is made that, the problem in Hollywood generally, not just with Christopher Nolan's interpretation of the Odyssey and what he left in and what he, the license that he took, or left out in the license that he took, is that it's just more of the same, where you're getting further and further away from an understanding of the original work, which is supposed to be foundational to Western civilization. And since nobody reads anymore, it's more important than ever that the screen versions are true to form.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to this overall claim. I do think we've had a lot of misappropriations of classic texts. I'm thinking especially of when Disney started remaking all of its great fairy tales. Yeah. Rachel Zegler coming out and playing Snow White and saying Snow White is a misogynist story, basically. Right. That stuff is incredibly grating. And so it put more pressure on Nolan, for sure, to not do that. I don't think that that's what's going on with the reinterpretations in this movie. I think you're much closer to just any adaptation is going to have to change the source material. And this is the bad news and the good news, because the bad news is, you're not going to get the full Odyssey in a movie. You do actually have to read the book. But the good news is you actually can read the book. It's an excellent argument for putting our money where our mouths are when we talk about this stuff, and actually going back and encountering these poems. When I set out into the world's most lucrative business, namely the scholarship of ancient literature, never predicted, had no idea that I would one day be living through a summer where the entire country is talking about Homer. And I think whether you love or hate what Nolan has done with the movie, we should all kind of agree that there's nothing that's going to beat this poem. There's nothing that's going to top it. That is why we think of it as a treasure of Western civilization. And my sense with this movie is, in general, it's not hostile to its source material. It is interpreting it as it has to, but it's also been pushing a lot of people back to the text. I mean,
exactly.
Translations of this poem are on bestseller lists now across the country. And I think that's kind of the best bottom line to take from this overall.
All right, I'll let you get back to counting all your money. Spencer Klavan, Associate Editor of the Claremont Review of Books and host of the Young Heretics podcast. Spencer, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And Spencer joined us in the alphawealthgroup.com answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer. It's news, opinion, and insight at the speed of your life. Streaming at 560theanswer.com on the AM 560 mobile app, or tell your